the historic ceremony in Washington early this week. I'm sure many of you are familiar with our guest, a former Brigadier General in the IDF, Michael Herzog, who served in various positions in the IDF and in the Ministry of Defense. Mike also has experience of 2 decades worth on the front line of negotiations with all of Israel's negotiating tracks, primarily with the Palestinians, but also the Jordanians and the Syrians. And I think it's fair to say has a very healthy range of contacts across the Arab world as well, kind of which were formerly covert relations. And we'd love to get into that. There's a technical point, recording just his opening remarks, and we'll turn the recording off so we can have an exchange of Q&A for anyone that's on the line that wants to ask following questions. So if we can begin, and I would say kind of 3 thoughts come to mind if we can start. First of all, as I mentioned, kind of with your range of contacts across the Arab world, if you could talk a little bit about those covert relations and how you see kind of how this relationship came to fruition and to the very public sharing of relations. I'd also love your reactions as to what happened in Washington and the details of the deal itself and the significance. And finally, kind of where that leaves the Palestinians and the ramifications for them in this new era. So, Michael Herzog, thank you very much. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Thanks for BICOM for arranging this. Let me start with some opening comments about these new developments. I belong to those who think that this is of huge importance, of historical proportions. It's the first time in 26 years that we have peace agreement with the UAE and Bahrain. The last being with Jordan in 1994, and I happened to be there, and I would like to note some differences between the 2 peace agreements we had with Egypt and Jordan back then, with Egypt in '82, and the current peace agreements. With Egypt and Jordan, we had a long history of bitter wars, and we had bitter disputes over territory and other issues as well. So those agreements we signed with them were first and foremost non-belligerency agreements. They were agreements between governments supposed to ultimately lead to a warm peace between people as well. But that has not happened. Peace with Jordan and Egypt remained cold for a variety of reasons. In this case, we are talking about treaties of peace, or more accurately, normalizing relations with 2 countries with which we never had war or armed conflict. We do not share a common border. There's no territorial dispute. And in this case, the order is reversed. We're talking about first normalizing relations between governments and people. We're talking about warm peace, and all the rest will follow later on. I would say that what we just witnessed is a surfacing of deep undercurrents, which have been there for many years, as you correctly noted, Richard. I was part of talking to some of our regional partners for many years, and it was evident that one day this will surface and will come about. So let me talk a little bit about the deeper layer of developing relations between us and some of our neighbors. I think what happened, and that's especially true for the last decade, this region has experienced a decade of so-called Arab Spring, wars, turmoil, internal strife. We've seen ISIS rise and fall. We've seen leaders depose. We witness a region characterized by a series of failed or failing states, deep economic and social problems. And regional actors who aspired for stability looked around them, saw the turmoil, and said to themselves, who could be our partner in standing up to these challenges? And gradually, they came to the conclusion that Israel is there to be a partner. Israel is a beacon of stability, functionality in that region. Against this background, and especially given the Iranian aspirations or ambitions, nuclear ambitions and regional ambitions, which came to the fore, I would say, after ISIS, rose and took over parts of the Middle East, the heart of the Middle East, and now increasingly also Turkish ambitions, which I think steer the pot not only in the Mediterranean, but across the Middle East, and are troubling for many of our neighbors. Their desire to partner with Israel to stand up to these regional challenges has increased considerably. And adding to that is the fact that the impression, at least in the Middle East, is that the US is in an historic mode of retreat from the Middle East, at least I would say, decreasing its military footprint in the region. So that, I think, also increased the motivation to partner with Israel. And along the way, they witnessed the JCPOA, the nuclear deal with Iran, which was troubling to them. And people you talk to in the region, I talk to a lot of people in the region, believe that this characterizes not only a democratic administration, but also a Republican one. It's the same with Trump, who talks about taking forces out of the Middle East and so on. Adding to that is increasing criticism of the Arabs on the Palestinians, and what you hear more and more, and that's especially true about the Gulf Arabs, less so in the first circle surrounding Israel, like Jordan or Egypt, but certainly in the Gulf, you hear increasing criticism of the Palestinians and Palestinian leadership. People say more and more, we helped them, we fought on their behalf, we gave them financial assistance, and they evaded opportunities to break through to peace with Israel. They are corrupt, they are dysfunctional, they are ungrateful, and so on and so forth. So if you take all of these elements together, you understand how come these quiet relations that were developing underground surfaced now and translated themselves to agreements between the UAE and Israel, Bahrain, Israel, and potentially others to follow. What's in the agreement? When you read the documents which were released after the signing, it is obvious that the emphasis is on bilateral relations. There's a long list of areas where Israel and the Gulf states could cooperate: economic cooperation, cooperation on environmental issues, energy issues, telecommunications, so on and so forth. There is only scant mention of the Palestinian issue in very general terms, talking about the need for a negotiated solution which will meet the legitimate aspirations and needs of both parties, but nothing more than that. No mention of state solution or any other specificity. But there is an interesting mention in the agreement with the UAE about the need to design what they call a strategic agenda for the Middle East together with the United States, so as to enhance regional security and stability. And I think this is basically alluding to the need to develop some kind of regional architecture to stand up to Iran and its proxies, but also increasingly so to stand up to Turkey and its ambitions, which are very troubling, as I mentioned, to major regional actors. Who's next in line? President Trump mentioned various numbers. He said 5, 6, 7, then jumped to 9. Now he's down to 5. The obvious candidates are in the Gulf. We're talking about Oman and Saudi Arabia. In North Africa, we're talking about Morocco. We also talk about Sudan. These are the 4 obvious candidates that is well known that there are talks with them about normalizing relations with Israel. With each of them, there is a different set of problems. For example, in Saudi Arabia, I think for as long as the king is there and he is officially committed to tying normalization with Israel to the Israeli-Palestinian issue, we're probably not going to see, speedy normalization, but with a different leadership, that's definitely possible. Morocco would like the United States to recognize its control over Western Sahara. Sudan would like the United States to take it off the list of terror sponsors and so on. So there are still some strings attached, but I think the trend that we've seen, the trend line is going to develop and we'll see more joining. You asked about the impact on the Israeli-Palestinian issue, and this is a major, major question that needs to be discussed. Generally speaking, here in Israel and in the region as a whole, when you follow what people say about it and how they relate it to the Israeli-Palestinian context, you see in a very generalized manner, 3 basic attitudes. There's this very negative attitude to the new developments because they took away the veto power Palestinians had over Arab decision-makings on relations with Israel. And those who subscribe to this approach say, by taking away the veto power, Palestinians will have less leverage, and this will probably distance the prospects of breaking through to a solution between Israelis and Palestinians. There's the opposite attitude, which says since the Palestinians have not really met the challenge of peacemaking with Israel for so many years. They rejected peace proposals and so on. It's time to lower their expectation. Let's focus on expanding Israeli-Arab relations and normalization. And in time, perhaps a new Palestinian leadership will come forward, come around. They will understand that time is not on their side, and so let's put the Palestinians aside for now, focus on Israeli-Arab normalizations, and the Palestinians will fall in place later on. There is an in-between approach to which I subscribe, which says that you should view this new development as potentially also opening space to Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking. We tried for decades to do it bilaterally. I was part of this effort for many, many years. We failed. It's probably beyond the 2 parties to break this logjam and break through to an agreed solution. But with regional involvement, you can open space and provide legitimacy to both parties. The fact of the matter is that normalization between the UAE and Israel probably stopped the application of Israeli sovereignty over parts of the West Bank. It is part of this, whole deal. And while the Palestinian issue does not have the same, does not top the Arab agenda as it used to for decades, it is still relevant. It still resonates with Arab governments and Arab publics, and Arabs could use it. They now have acquired some leverage over Israel in order to open space for Israeli-Palestinian peacemaking, and I believe there's a lot of potential there. Of course, it depends on leaderships on both sides. I would say that unfortunately, I see the current Palestinian leadership with no any relevant response to these new developments. We hear the same talking points that we heard for many, many years. I think they should kind of recalculate where they're heading, their strategy. They should re-engage the United States. They should re-engage Israel. And I mean, there's stop coordination because of annexation. But now that annexation is off the table, they should resume it. They stop taking tax revenues that Israel collects on their behalf because of annexation. Now that it's off the table, they should take it. It's their own money. The PA is on the verge of economic meltdown. Gaza in a very bad situation, and there's a lot of tension between Gaza and Israel. It's time the Palestinian leadership also calculates where exactly it is headed. Bottom line, this is a major development with a very big potential for the region. And I think all parties concerned should put their heads together on how to translate this also in order to generate some positive dynamics for a change also between Israelis and Palestinians. So let me stop here, and I'm ready to take questions.